The rain hammered against the towering glass windows of the penthouse apartment, as if someone outside were insistently trying to get in. Helen Davis was kneeling on the pale living room rug, one hand resting on Michael's slender back and the other trying to hold her phone steady against her ear. The boy was breathing in short, sharp gasps, every inhalation seeming to be torn from a text placed too deep for an 8-year-old child. On the coffee table, a neat row of medication bottles trembled with the vibration of unanswered calls. Richard Sterling didn't answer the first call, nor the second, nor the third. Helen watched his name glow on the screen before falling back into voicemail, and for a second, she felt the old humiliation of being treated like an endless, inconvenient background noise inside her own home. But that night, there was no room for wounded pride. Michael was pale, his lips beginning to lose their color, and his small fingers gripped the hem of her blouse with a trust that broke her heart. Helen took a deep breath and dialed. Again. On the other side of the city, Richard glanced quickly at the phone abandoned on the glass table of the hotel suite. The device vibrated next to an open bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet, 2 glasses, and Sophia Martin's satisfied smile. She ran her fingers along the collar of his dress shirt, as if erasing all traces of the life awaiting him outside those walls. Richard narrowed his eyes when he saw his wife's name. There was no alarm, only irritation. To him, Helen always chose the worst moments to remind him she existed. Sophia tilted her head, letting her dark hair fall over a bare shoulder, and asked if he was going to answer. Her voice carried a practiced sweetness, but her eyes held the cold vigilance of someone assessing every gesture. Richard picked up the phone, saw the sequence of missed calls, and let out a low, joyless laugh. He said Helen was dramatizing again, probably because she suspected something. Then he turned the device face down, as if that simple movement could silence an entire family. Helen didn't know where Richard was, but she knew he had heard at least one of the calls before ignoring it. There were years of coexistence in that painful instinct. Her husband knew about Michael's condition. He knew the protocols. He knew about the special emergency concierge contract, which could only be released with his digital authorization, because Richard insisted on centralizing everything in his name, just as he did with corporations, properties, and people. She opened the private medical service app, but the screen demanded confirmation. From the primary account holder, the code was sent to Richard's cell phone. Michael tried to say something, but the sentence fractured into a cough. Helen brought her face close to his and asked him to save his energy. Inside, the physician she had been for 15 years was calculating signs, risks, minutes with cruel precision. The boy needed specialized transport with full cardiac monitoring, a prepared team, and rapid access to the affiliated pediatric center. The mother, however, saw beyond the technique. She saw her son, who still slept with a cloth dinosaur that drew blue moons, and believed his father would one day show up for a school presentation. She called the front desk, requested their car, and ran to Michael's room to grab his medical go-bag. The apartment, decorated by professionals paid to create an image of perfection, seemed to mock her with its useless beauty. There were framed family photographs on expensive consoles, almost all chosen by PR advisors. Richard smiled in them, with the impeccable posture of a man accustomed to winning. Michael appeared between his parents, small and fragile, while Helen sustained the invisible world behind that portrait. The elevator took less than a minute to arrive, but to Helen it felt like an endless crossing. Michael was leaning against her chest, covered by a blue puffer jacket, his eyes half open, and his breathing increasingly irregular. The doorman, a man named Oscar, paled when he saw them. without asking questions. He held the door and ran to alert the driver. Helen thanked him with a brief nod, concentrated on not letting panic take command of her hands. She had saved strangers on worse nights. She needed to save her own son. As the town car advanced along the rain-slicked avenue, Helen continued calling. Between one call and another, she sent short, clear messages without accusation. Michael is in crisis. Need the code. Respond now. Then another. Richard, it's grave. This isn't an argument. It's our son. The words seemed too small in the face of the terror growing in the back seat. Michael opened his eyes and asked if his dad was coming. Helen held the lie in her throat, unable to release it entirely, and just said they were doing everything necessary. At the hotel, Richard walked barefoot across the plush carpet, moving away from the phone, as if the silent sound of the vibrations could still reach him. Sophia watched his every move with a mixture of triumph and impatience. She had waited months for that night, for that intimate confirmation that the wife no longer had a real place in his life. She spoke of a dinner in the Hamptons, a charity gala at the Met, how her presence beside him could be presented to the market with elegance. Richard listened, but there was an irritating shadow on his forehead. He didn't love Sophia with the depth she imagined, nor did he love Helen with the loyalty he had once promised. He loved control, public admiration, the obedient noise of doors opening before he touched them. Sophia offered him youth, applause, and the illusion of applause, guilt-free restart. Helen offered memory, accountability, and the uncomfortable truth of a sick child who exposed his powerlessness. Therefore, Richard preferred to transform her worry into hysteria. It was easier to despise Helen than to admit he was afraid of Michael. In the car, Helen realized Michael was cold sweating. She asked the driver to speed up, but the rain had flooded parts of the FDR drive, and a line of red-tinted taillights stretched ahead like a sentence. She evaluated the possibility of getting out and running, but the hospital was still too far. She called 911, informed them of the clinical data, requested arrival guidance to the nearest ER, and warned that they might need to receive him without prior authorization from their specific specialized plan. On the other end, the operator asked protocol questions, and Helen answered with a calm that tore her apart inside. Michael always called that calm her hospital voice. He used to say that when his mom spoke like that, even fear got embarrassed and lowered its head. Helen remembered this as she ran her fingers through the boy's damp hair, trying to keep his consciousness anchored. She talked about the beach in Montauk, about the carrot cake they would bake on Sunday, about the promise to buy new paints. Michael listened in silence, but his eyes no longer followed the images. He was looking at some point beyond her, as if an invisible distance were opening up. St. Jude's Medical Center emerged behind a curtain of rain and white light. Helen got out of the car before the driver could fully open the door. She entered, carrying Michael in her arms, yelling for a pediatric team, and for an instant, everyone in the reception area realized that this woman was not just a desperate mother. There was authority in her posture, a ferocious precision in the way she described the boy's condition, the medications, previous procedures, and immediate risks. 2 nurses ran over with a gurney, and Michael was taken back. Camille Rogers, the charge nurse on duty, recognized Helen before even hearing her name. Years earlier, when Camille was still a recent graduate, Helen had defended a low-income patient against the negligence of an arrogant attending surgeon. The memory crossed the night like a small light. Camille wasted no time. She connected Michael to the monitor, paged the pediatric cardiologist, and requested IV access. Helen stayed by his side, answering questions, but had to step back when the team began to act. The mother wanted to touch her son. The doctor knew she needed to give them space. The hospital system, however, demanded immediate authorization to transfer Michael to the Advanced Intervention Suite, affiliated with the executive plan of Sterling Health Global. The word authorization fell upon Helen like bureaucratic violence. She explained that the primary account holder was inaccessible, that the patient's life could not depend on a code sent to a turned-off cell phone, that there were legal grounds for emergency care under EMTALA. The attending physician hesitated, not for lack of compassion, but out of knowledge of the weight of denying norms imposed by insurance companies that crushed careers with asignature. Helen felt something ancient reignite. It wasn't just fear. It was indignation. She spoke her son's full name, cited medical articles, protocols, risks of omission. Her voice didn't rise, but every word gained the firmness of a blade. Camille backed her up, saying the vitals were crashing. The doctor authorized the initial stabilizing procedures, still awaiting formal clearance for the most complex resources. Those minutes lost between screens, passwords, and administrative fears could never be returned. Helen knew this, as she watched the line on the monitor oscillate with increasing fragility. Richard finally picked up the phone again. There were more than 20 calls, texts, and an alert from the medical app. His face hardened, not out of remorse, but out of anger at being cornered by evidence. Sophia approached and saw part of the messages. For a brief second, her confidence wavered. She asked if it was better for him to call back. Richard breathed slowly, as he did before firing directors in tense board meetings. He said Helen knew how to manipulate emergencies to get attention. He opened the app, saw the authorization request for the specialized team, and did not confirm it. He let the screen time out. Then he poured more wine, with a hand a little less steady than he would have liked. Sophia pretended not to notice. Both understood that something had been chosen in that silence, even if neither had the courage to name the choice. Richard said that if it were truly grave, the hospital would act without him. It was a comfortable sentence, almost rational, the kind powerful men use to wash their own cowardice before the blood appears. Sophia touched his hand and smiled, but the room seemed colder. At St. Jude's, Michael went into severe arrhythmia. The monitor's alarm cut the break datacom some from lidded air, and the team moved with urgency. Helen was pushed back 2 steps by Camille, who held her by the shoulders with respectful firmness. The former doctor inside her understood every gesture, every medication, every command. The mother inside her shattered. Michael looked too small under the harsh lights of the trauma bay, too small for so much technology, for so many wires, for so much waiting caused by adults who had transformed care into a contract and love into absence. Helen asked to speak to him when there was a brief stabilization. She approached. The gurney held her son's hand and felt the weak pressure of his fingers. Michael opened his eyes just enough to recognize her. He said he was tired. She replied that she knew, but that he was the bravest boy in the world. Her voice came out clean, without breaking, because Helen offered Michael the last shelter she possessed. He asked again for his father. Now, almost without sound, Helen kissed his forehead and said she was right. There. The answer wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth Michael sought either. He seemed to understand with a sad, precocious, unfair wisdom. A tear slid down the side of his face, mixing with the sweat. Helen wanted to promise that everything would end well, but she had spent her life detesting false guarantees in the face of death. So she promised something else. She said he was not alone, that she had loved him since before his first heartbeat and would love him after all the clocks stopped. Michael tried to smile, and that effort destroyed her. When the second crisis came, there was no delicacy in the world capable of softening it. The doctor initiated maneuvers. Camille administered medication. Another nurse recorded times. Helen stood against the wall, her hands clasped tight to her chest, her eyes dry with horror. She didn't pray for a miracle. She prayed for justice, though at that moment she didn't even know to whom she addressed such a request. The room seemed distant, as if everything were happening underwater in thick liquid. The doctor's voice cut through this water with precise commands, increasingly urgent, increasingly less hopeful. Michael died at 2:17 inches the morning. The phrase wasn't stated immediately, but Helen felt it before anyone had the courage to pronounce it. The monitor drew a flat line that no amount of love could bend back. Camille cried silently, still holding a useless piece of gauze. The doctor removed his gloves with trembling hands and apologized. Helen walked to the gurney, carefully moved a wire away from her son's face, and laid her head beside his. She didn't scream. The scream remained forever trapped somewhere, nameless. The hospital continued existing around her, with footsteps, voices, and doors opening. But Helen no longer belonged to the same world. She observed Michael's eyelashes, the delicate curve of his mouth, the freckles he hated and that she considered small stars. She thought of Richard, of the silent phone, the unsent code, the invisible signature that weighed more than a child's chest. Grief arrived like ice, not fire. First, it froze her fingers, then her throat, then the exact center where hope used to live. At 3 a.m., Richard left the hotel with Sophia via the private elevator. His phone was in his suit pocket, now silent. He still hadn't opened Helen's last message sent minutes after the death. Don't come pretending haste. Michael is gone. Sophia realized something had changed in his face when the screen lit up inside the car. But Richard didn't read it aloud. The driver asked for the destination. For a few seconds, neither answered. The wet city reflected broken lights, and the early morning seemed to witness everything. Richard read the message once. Then again, the first reaction was offended. Disbelief, as if reality had committed an imprudence by contradicting him. Following that came a brutal fear. Not for his son, not yet, but for the consequences. He imagined newspapers, boards of directors, investors, questions about timelines and logs. Sophia slowly moved her hand away from his. For the first time that night, she saw not a powerful man, but someone exposed. Richard told the driver to head to the hospital. Too late for any gesture to resemble love. Helen was sitting in a private waiting room when he arrived. Her clothes were wet, her hair tied up haphazardly, her face immobile. Camille was near the door, like a silent guardian. Richard entered with calculated haste, tried to say his son's name, but Helen raised her eyes and he stopped. There was no hysteria there, no pleading, nor the fragility he hoped to be able to manage. There was a devastating lucidity. Helen looked at him like a doctor facing the cause of an preventable death. He asked where Michael was. The question sounded absurd, almost obscene, after so many ignored calls. Helen stood up slowly, said that Michael had been where he always was, waiting for a father who confused absence with power. Richard tried to defend himself, spoke of meetings, signal problems, of not imagining the gravity. Every excuse died before finishing. Helen didn't interrupt him. She let him drown in his own words, because she understood in that instant that the truth didn't need to shout to win. When Richard finally fell silent, Helen opened her hand and showed the phone. On the screen, the sequence of calls, messages, and times formed a timeline more implacable than any accusation. She said that one day he would explain every minute, not just to her, but to everyone who still believed in the image of the brilliant, generous, and indispensable man. Richard paled. Michael's name hung between them like a presence greater than the falled, sterling empire. Behind the door, the rain kept falling, washing the city without managing to clean that night. Michael's wake took place in a white chapel constructed at the top of a hill that seemed too far from the city to belong to the same world. There were flowers everywhere, tall arrangements sent by corporations, boards, banks, politicians, and hospitals that knew Richard Sterling as a sponsor of charity, benefits, and a buyer of elegant silences. Helen remained before the small casket, wearing a simple dark dress, hands clasped in front of her body, without accepting lingering condolences. Every expensive perfume that approached her seemed like an offense. Richard arrived surrounded by advisors, as if even grief needed a communications strategy. He wore an impeccable black suit, dark tie, and a carefully devastated face. He greeted people with contained hugs, received words of comfort, lowered his eyes at the right moment. Anyone seeing him from afar might imagine a destroyed father trying to conserve dignity. Helen, however, knew the difference between pain and performance. The man who had ignored her calls now held handkerchiefs as if they were proofs of humanity. While discreet photographers registered his domesticated tragedy, Sophia did not appear at the chapel, but her presence crossed the space like a scent left on fabric. Helen knew through Camille, who knew through a hotel staff member, that Richard had not been alone that night. The information didn't surprise her. It merely fitted a piece that already existed inside her. The adultery, which in another life would have been a central wound, became small in the face of death. It wasn't the betrayal of the body that mattered. It was Richard's choice for anything that kept him away from his own son's cry for help. During the ceremony, the priest spoke of innocence, mystery, of a peace that surpassed human understanding. Helen listened without anger, but also without comfort. She didn't want to transform Michael into a docile symbol to comfort guilty adults. He had been a concrete boy, afraid of thunderstorms, with a habit of separating Skittles by color. A short laugh when trying to hide mischief. She didn't want them to say he was in a better place so easily, as if that absolved those who failed to keep him alive in the place where he wanted to stay. Richard tried to approach when the ceremony ended. He extended a hand to touch Helen's shoulder, but she stepped away before contact. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible. Even so, it sliced through the salon like a blade. Some guests noticed and averted their eyes. Richard felt the heat of embarrassment rise up his neck. He couldn't bear being denied in public. He murmured that they needed to remain united. At least for Michael. Helen looked at him with a calm that made him feel more exposed than any scream could. She said that unity was too big a word to be used by someone who didn't answer the phone. Richard hardened his jaw but kept his voice low. He replied that this was not the moment for accusations, that both were suffering, that she needed to rest before drawing cruel conclusions. Helen almost admired the precision of the manipulation. He was transforming her grief into instability, his omission into a misunderstanding, Michael's death into a tragedy without responsible parties. This was how he managed companies, mergers, and other people's consciences. That night, back in the apartment, the silence had changed weight. Before it was a silence of abandonment, cut by Michael's breathing in his room, the noise of toys, the low sound of cartoons he watched when he felt pain. Now it was a silence without a center, a huge house holding the absence of a child. Helen entered her son's room and didn't turn on the light. She sat on the edge of the bed, touched the folded blanket, and felt that the world demanded of her a way to continue that still seemed indecent. Richard didn't enter the room. He stayed in the hallway talking on the phone in a controlled voice. Words like official statement, reputational risk, and responsible coverage reached Helen's ears in fragments. She closed her eyes. There was something monstrous about hearing her son's death translated into corporate language before the sheets had even lost his scent. When Richard finished the call, he approached slowly and said the press was already starting to speculate. The tragedy, according to him, needed to be conducted with maturity. Helen got up and left the room without answering. In the living room, Richard opened a leather portfolio and placed some documents on the table. He said the lawyers had prepared a simple statement, necessary to avoid media exploitation and preserve Michael's memory. The text stated that the death stemmed from a sudden and unavoidable complication, despite the best medical and family efforts. Helen read it without touching the paper. The word unavoidable shone before her, like an insulting lie. Richard waited, confident in her exhaustion. He spoke, softly, as if explaining something reasonable to a fragile person. He said that Michael had a severe condition, that no parent should carry guilt, that signing, that release would help both cross the process without external attacks. Helen asked if the release would also explain why the authorization code was not sans. Richard took a deep breath, irritated by her insistence on the detail that threatened to destroy the entire architecture of the official version. He said she was mixing grief with vengeance and that this wouldn't bring Michael back. The sentence fell between them with cold brutality. Helen felt the impact, but didn't retreat. For the first time since the death, she perceived that her pain had a form. It wasn't an abyss without an edge. It was a blade being forged. She pushed the documents back toward Richard and said she would sign no lie whatsoever. For an instant, Richard lost the mask of the devastated widower. His eyes became the same eyes directors feared in closed-door meetings. He reminded her that she had depended financially on him since leaving the hospital. Helen listened to the entire threat because she needed to know the terrain of the war that was beginning. Richard spoke of accounts, properties, contracts, lawyers, of the symbolic custody of Michael's memory, as if even a dead son could be managed as a family asset. The more he spoke, the more he revealed the small moral gear that moved him. He didn't understand love, only possession. He didn't understand responsibility, only damage control. Helen didn't cry. She just said that he could control money, but he didn't control what she saw, nor what the hospital had recorded. The next morning, Richard left the apartment before dawn. He said he needed to go to corporate headquarters to face the board and protect the employees from an employee's unjust crisis. Helen didn't ask what injustice he was talking about. Hearing the door close, she walked to Michael's room and began to organize his things with an almost ritualistic delicacy. She didn't want to pack everything away quickly, as some people advised. Nor did she want to transform the room into an untouchable sanctuary. She wanted to understand what remained there. what Michael could still tell her. She found drawings in a drawer, toy cars aligned inside a box, and a collection of rocks he picked up in parks and called planets. In the back of the closet was his child's tablet with a scratched blue case. Helen turned it on by impulse. The battery was low, but the screen lit up. Between games and photos, she found a folder with audio recordings. The name of the first one was simple. For When Mommy Is Sad. Helen brought her hand to her mouth, as if the sound not yet heard could already knock her down. She pressed the file, and Michael's voice occupied the room. It was low, a little raspy, with the pauses of someone who thought a lot before speaking. He said that Mommy shouldn't cry hidden in the bathroom, because he always heard, even when he pretended to sleep. He said she made the best chicken, noodle soup in the world, even though she put in too many vegetables. He said that when he grew up, he wanted to be a doctor just like her, but a doctor who also designed rockets. Helen laughed and cried at the same time, unable to separate tenderness from devastation. There were other recordings. In one of them, Michael spoke of his father. There was no hatred in his voice, and that made everything harder. He said that Richard had promised to go to the school presentation, but the chair remained empty. He said that maybe CEOs had problems that were too big, bigger than sons. Then, as if trying to correct his own sadness, added that one day his dad would have time. Helen listened to the end with the sensation that every word was a witness. Michael didn't accuse Richard. He just showed the loneliness that busy adults called routine. At the headquarters of Sterling Health Global in Midtown Manhattan, Richard occupied the head of a long table facing restless executives. The company controlled networks of clinics, emergency plans, and hospital contracts across the Eastern Seaboard. The death of the CEO's own son, in circumstances still uncertain, could be managed as private tragedy or explode as a public allegory of the system's cruelty. Richard knew this. He spoke with firmness, demanded unity, forbade leaks, and ordered an internal review that was not supposed to produce surprises. Everyone understood the message. Reviewing in that building meant selecting what would survive. Sophia was in his office when the meeting ended. She wore a light-colored dress and an expression of studied worry. Richard was irritated to see her there, but also felt relief. Sophia belonged to the world where he was still desired, obeyed, and indispensable. She approached, said she was very sorry about Michael, although she had never been intimate with the child. The phrase came out correct and empty. Then, she spoke of Helen, of possible accusations, the need to prevent a woman taken by grief from destroying years of work. Richard sat behind his desk and ran his hands down his face. For the first time, the weariness seemed real. Sophia seized the opening. She said he needed to act before Helen found allies, that the public narrative must be constructed with compassion for her, not against her. It was more efficient to present her as a devastated mother, emotionally incapable of comprehending medical complexity. Richard looked at Sophia with renewed attention. She didn't just offer desire, she offered method, and at that moment, method seemed more useful than comfort. At Street Jude's, Camille asked for an informal copy of the night's logs, knowing she might lose her job for it. She didn't violate charts, didn't falsify anything, just secured numbers that might disappear in some convenient system. Update. She had seen many poor patients delayed by absurd authorizations, but Michael had the last name that usually opened doors. If even he had been swallowed by that control system, how many anonymous people hadn't died without anyone recording the failure? Camille thought of Helen and knew she would seek her out. Helen received the nurse in the late afternoon. Camille entered the apartment, carefully, like someone invading the interior of a wound. She brought a bag with Michael's belongings collected at the hospital and an envelope with notations of times. She didn't say that this was proof, because the word still seemed dangerous. She just said that Helen might need to remember the exact sequence. Events. The two women stood in silence for a few seconds. Then, Helen touched the Bloxlas envelope and thanked her. Not as a grieving mother, but as someone recognizing courage. Camille recounted that the system registered the authorization request, the absence of response, and the delayed release of procedures. She also recounted that an administrative supervisor had called in the morning asking for discretion and instructing the team to avoid comments about protocol failures. Helen listened to everything with absolute attention. Her face didn't alter, but inside, something was organizing itself. The pain continued there, immense, but now there were lines, times, names. Michael's death ceased to be a fog and began to reveal a structure. After Camille left, Helen opened the old laptop she used to organize her son's medical records. She created a folder named Michael and began to gather files, calls made, text messages sent, screenshots of the app, hospital notes, tablet, recordings. Every item was saved with a date and description. She didn't have a plice, lawyer yet, nor strategy, nor guarantees. She only had the discipline that had made her a respected doctor, and the silent fury of a mother refusing to allow her son's death to be archived as a convenient fatality. That same night, Richard returned, accompanied by two lawyers. The choice to bring witnesses inside the house where Michael still seemed to breathe in. The walls revealed to Helen the size of the distance between them. One of the lawyers, Mr. Vance, spoke with a honeyed voice about family, preservation, confidential agreements, psychological support, and shielding AT against speculation. The other remained silent, noting reactions. Richard stood near the window, feigning moral discomfort with a meeting he himself had ordered. Helen offered water to no one. Mr. Vance explained that the company was willing to create a fund in Michael's honor, provided Helen signed the statement, and agreed not to divulge incomplete information. The word fund tried to enter the room dressed as generosity, but Helen recognized its smell of a payoff. She asked if the value would increase if she also accepted, saying that Richard had been present during the crisis. The lawyer blinked, caught by a frankness he didn't expect. Richard advanced a step and said she was crossing all limits. Helen replied that the limit had been crossed when a child needed authorization and encountered silence. Mr. Vance tried to regain control, saying that emotions could prejudice a future judicial dispute. Helen looked at him and asked if that phrase was a threat or advice. The lawyer smiled, without showing his teeth. He said it was just reality. Then, Helen opened the folder on her laptop and projected onto the living room television the list of calls made to Richard. The atmosphere changed. Even the silent lawyer stopped writing. Richard stood immobile before the Times. There was a precision there impossible to soften. Helen didn't exhibit everything, didn't show Michael's recordings, didn't reveal Camille's notes. She just let them comprehend that she wasn't lost in despair she was documenting. Mr. Vance slowly gathered his papers and said perhaps it was better to continue. On another occasion, Richard, however, didn't want to leave his own living room, defeated. He approached Helen and spoke low, almost without moving his lips, that she didn't know who she was fighting against. Her response came, In the same tone, she said she knew exactly. She was fighting against the man who had taught his own son that waiting was a form of love. Richard recoiled as if struck in the chest, but the wound quickly covered itself. With anger, he ordered the lawyers out and stayed alone with her. For a few seconds, he seemed about to ask for forgiveness. Helen saw that possibility cross his face and die before being born. Richard's pride was faster than any remorse. He chose defense again. He said that she also carried guilt, that she had been a doctor, and even so hadn't managed to save Michael. The cruelty of the sentence filled the room with a new darkness. Helen felt her legs weaken, but she didn't allow him to perceive it. Guilt was the most intimate territory of her pain, and Richard was trying to invade it to survive. She approached until she was a step away from him. She said she would carry forever the question about what she could have done better. But he would carry another, simpler and more devastating one. Why didn't you answer? Richard left, slamming the door. Helen remained in the living room, breathing slowly, until the tremor in her hands diminished. Then, she returned to Michael's room and listened to another recording. In it, the boy talked about a science class on stars. He said that some lights we see in the sky died a long time ago, but they keep reaching us. Helen sat on the floor, holding the tablet against her chest. She thought that perhaps Michael had left, without knowing, the metaphor that would sustain her. He was gone, but his light still needed to reach dark places. 2 days later, the first public statement from Sterling Health Global was released. The text lamented the irreparable loss of the Sterling family and exalted Michael's legacy of courage. It spoke of natural complications, exemplary monitoring, and respect for privacy. Helen read every line with an ETIED, almost clinical serenity. The lie wasn't gross. It was elegant, carefully polished, made to be repeated by hurried journalists and interested friends. Richard hadn't waited for her signature. He decided to advance without her, betting that the weight of the empire would muffle any contestation. The reaction came quickly. Messages of condolences flooded social networks. Old photographs of Richard with Michael were republished by corporate profiles. In one of them, Richard held his son in his lap during a company event, both surrounded by blue balloons. Helen remembered that day. Michael had a fever, wanted to leave, but Richard insisted on the photo. Because foreign investors, I were present. Now, the image circulated as proof of tenderness. Helen turned off. Her phone before nausea turned into something more violent. In the late afternoon, she received a text from an unknown number. The sender identified himself as Andrew Miller, a lawyer specializing in medical and corporate liability. He said he knew her work years ago when she had denounced irregularities in a municipal ER. He also said he had faced Sterling Health in 3 lawsuits and lost, not for lack of proof, but because witnesses disappeared. Documents were reclassified, and judges changed their understanding in curious ways. Helen read the message twice. She didn't respond immediately. Andrew added that he didn't want to exploit her grief. But if she intended to seek the truth, she should protect every file before Richard understood the scope of what she possessed. The phrase confirmed something Helen already felt. This wouldn't be a domestic dispute, nor just a moral accusation against an unfaithful husband. It was a war against a machine, designed to win through exhaustion. She saved the message, made external copies of the documents, and sent a short response. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Discreet place. No press. That night, Helen dreamed of Michael sitting at the kitchen table, drawing a house without doors. In the dream, she asked why there was no entrance, and he answered that some people only remembered to arrive when they could no longer get in. She woke before dawn, her chest feeling like she had run through entire streets. She got up, washed her face, and tied back her hair. For the first time since the death, she chose an outfit not to look mourning or respectable, but to move with firmness. Dark trousers, a white shirt, flats. Before leaving, she opened Michael's folder and listened again to the recording about the stars. She didn't cry. Her son's voice didn't push her to the ground that time. It lifted her up. Helen took Camille's envelope, the phone with the calls, a flash drive with copies, and the courage that still seemed borrowed from someone stronger. Closing the apartment door, she understood that she would never stop being Michael's mother. But from that moment on, she would also be the witness Richard feared most. The coffee shop chosen by Helen was on a narrow street in Brooklyn, far from the Brooklyn neighborhoods where Richard was recognized before even stepping out of the car. There were worn wooden tables, the smell of hot bread, and a window fogged by the fine drizzle that still persisted over the city. She arrived 10 minutes early, sat with her back to the wall, and left untouched a single cup on the place's table. The former doctor in her observed exits, faces, gestures. The grieving mother held inside her purse the recorded voice of her son, like someone carrying a heart outside their chest. Andrew Miller entered without haste, wearing a simple suit and carrying a canvas messenger bag. He didn't look like a man promising easy victories. He was thin, with graying hair at the temples, attentive eyes, and a kind of honest weariness in his shoulders. He greeted Helen with respect, without trying to hug her, without offering platitudes about strength or destiny. He sat before her, said he was very sorry about Michael. The simplicity of the sentence, free of theatricality, made Helen lower her eyes for an instant. There were consolations that wounded less when they didn't try to save anyone. Andrew listened first without interrupting. Helen described the crisis, the calls, the app demanding authorization, the arrival at the hospital, the delay, the death. She didn't cry while speaking. Every event came out of her mouth like a clinical record. But Andrew perceived that precision wasn't coldness. It was the only bridge she had managed to build over the abyss. When she finished, she placed the phone on the table and showed the call log. Andrew leaned in, observed the times, and took a deep breath. He said that this wasn't just moral abandonment. He explained that liability could open on several proscendescent fronts. There was Richard's personal conduct, cruel and decisive. But there was also the authorization system his company imposed on emergency situations. If they proved that financial protocols delayed vital care, Michael would cease to be an isolated case and become the door to something much bigger. Helen listened in silence. She didn't want her son's death to be used as an instrument, but she understood that perhaps justice for Michael demanded illuminating other hidden deaths in the same dark corridor. Andrew recounted his history with Sterling Health. 3 families had sought him out in recent years, all with reports of delays, denials, blocked transfers, and authorizations inexplicably retained until the condition became irreversible. In one case, a retired teacher lost the chance for urgent cardiac surgery. In another, a gig economy driver was left with neurological sequelae after hours, awaiting clearance. Andrew had partial documents, fragile testimonies, loose pieces. What he never had was someone like Helen, with technical knowledge, public position, and courage to face the center of the machine. Helen didn't like hearing the word courage. It seemed like clothing too big for a woman who that morning had almost failed to open Michael's sock drawer. She said she didn't feel brave, just incapable of allowing Richard to bury the truth, along with their son. Andrew accepted the correction with a slight nod, replied that often courage was exactly that. Not an absence of fear, but the moral inability to obey the lie. For the first time, Helen felt she had an ally before her, not an opportunist. They traced the first steps: preserve evidence on independent servers, notarize messages and calls, judicially request app data, identify hospital professionals willing to depose, and map internal decisions of Sterling Health. Andrew insisted that Richard would attack her credibility before attacking the Prosley Ballon facts. Helen would be called unstable, vengeful, fragilized by grief. Her history as a doctor would be overturned, her leaving the hospital transformed into suspicion, her motherhood judged by people who had never held a dying child in their arms. Helen heard it all without surprise. Richard had already started this path, inside their home. What hit her was realizing he would likely use intimate memories against her. Nights of exhaustion, crying spells, arguments about treatment, anything that could be ripped out of context and offered to the public as proof of imbalance. She thought of Michael, who had heard her sobs in the paint-blanked dash-in bathroom and recorded a message to console her. The boy's love could turn into ammunition in the wrong hands. The idea caused a ferocious nausea, but also hardened her resolve. At Sterling Health headquarters, Richard analyzed reports with the irritation of Comedy.com, someone watching the world lose its composure. The public note hadn't produced the expected silence. Some journalists began asking about the care timeline, and anonymous profiles mentioned his absence on the night of the death. Richard summoned Vance, 2 legal directors, and the head of communications. He ordered them to investigate leaks at the hospital and find any element suggesting emotional instability in Helen. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In that building, his calm was more threatening than shouts. Sophia was present, sitting near the window, pretending to check emails. Since Michael's death, she oscillated between fear and ambition. She knew the tragedy could drag her into the mud, but she also saw an opportunity to become indispensable to Richard. She suggested carefully that Helen might accept a discreet separation if she received sufficient asset guarantees. Richard replied that Helen didn't want money. The phrase came out with disdain, but also with discomfort. For the first time, he faced someone he couldn't buy because she had already lost what mattered most. Vance proposed freezing some joint accounts preventively under the justification of asset protection. Richard authorized it without hesitating. He also asked them to verify Helen's recent contacts, mainly lawyers, journalists, and hospital staff. Sophia observed the naturalness with which he ordered sieges, imagined if one day that same logic would turn against her. The thought didn't born of guilt, but self-preservation. She knew men like Richard well enough to know there were no permanent accomplices, only conveniences with an expiration date. When Helen tried to pay for parking after the meeting with Andrew, the card was declined. She tried another, then accessed the bank app and saw restrictions on accounts. Richard always called family accounts. The word restriction appeared as his signature. For an instant, She felt the old siege closing in. Andrew perceived it before she spoke and paid without comment. Outside, Helen breathed the cold air and said Richard had started. Andrew replied that it was expected, but didn't let the sentence sound like consolation. Expected didn't mean less. Violent. Back in the apartment, Helen found a message from Richard saying financial decisions needed to be reviewed until she demonstrated stability. The choice of the word was so calculated, it almost ripped a joyless smile from her. Stability. As if a mother only deserved access to her own life if she suffered. Conveniently, she didn't respond. Instead, she opened a new file and recorded .com, the time of the message, the change in accounts, and the practical impact of the measure. It wasn't just a wounded wife noting cruelties. It was an investigator, documenting a pattern of coercion. Camille arrived at nightfall, wearing ordinary clothes and a low baseball cap, as if she were committing a crime by visiting a grieving woman. She brought new information. A hospital systems tech, a friend of hers, confirmed that the authorization request for Michael sat pending for precious minutes, and that, after the death, someone had tried to access the administrative history of the dent care outside the regular workflow. They hadn't deleted data yet, but they had looked. Helen understood the urgency. She asked Camille not to expose herself beyond necessity. Camille replied that she had been exposed since the night she watched Michael die waiting. The phrase united the two in a heavy silence. Helen realized Camille carried her own guilt. The guilt of professionals who remain alive in the face of systems that prevent them from acting fully. She touched the nurse's hand and said no one there would confuse the executioners with those who tried to hold the door open. Camille closed her eyes for a second, then revealed that an old colleague, Lucy Chen, used to work in the auditing department of Sterling Health and left abruptly after contesting urgency denials. Maybe she knew where to look. Andrew found Lucy Chen 2 days later in a small independent bookstore where she worked after abandoning her corporate career. The woman looked at the shelves as one who preferred the company of silent stories to signed reports. Initially, she refused to talk. She said she had kids, rent, fear. Andrew didn't insist with heroic speeches. He just showed a photograph of Michael, authorized by Helen, an image of the boy smiling with blue paint on his nose. Lucy held the paper for too long. When she spoke, her voice came low. She said there were many Michaels. Lucy accepted meeting Helen in a discreet office borrowed by Andrew. She brought an old notebook, not official documents, but personal notes of codes, dates, and cases that had tormented her. She explained that Sterling Health possessed a financial risk algorithm integrated into emergency authorizations. Officially, it was a fraud management tool. In practice, it flagged high-cost, chronic, or low recovery probability patients, inducing delays and additional reviews. The orders never came written as kill or deny. They came as await validation, request second analysis, confirm eligibility. Helen listened with a stillness that frightened even Andrew. Inside, every word of Lucy's beat against her memory of the emergency room. Michael hadn't just been a victim of his father's absence. He had been captured by a machine, Richard, built to transform seconds of life into cost calculations. The revelation expanded her pain to an almost unbearable scale. Michael was unique to her, absolute, unrepeatable. For the system, he had been a risk profile, a delayable number. Helen felt the urge to break something, but grabbed a pen and asked for details. While the investigation advanced, Richard initiated his invisible campaign. A gossip columnist published that Helen Davis was facing intense emotional fragility and close friends feared her fixation on finding blame. A former colleague, pressured by old ties to Sterling Health, insinuated in an interview that she left the hospital due to temperament conflicts. Fake profiles on social media asked why an experienced doctor hadn't called a regular ambulance instead of a private car. Digital cruelty grew fast, fed by people confusing curiosity with judgment. Helen read enough to understand the method, then stopped. Not out of weakness, but discipline. Andrew taught that responding to Tay-Flu, every attack was allowing Richard to choose the battlefield. They needed to take the facts to a place where rhetoric had less space. Thus, they filed a judicial measure to preserve company and hospital data based on the risk of evidence destruction. The judge responsible, known for excessive caution, didn't grant everything, but ordered the safeguarding of specific records related to Michael's care. It was a small, technical victory without applause. To Helen, it seemed like the first crack in a wall. Richard received the judicial decision during a meeting with investors, read the message on his tablet, and kept his face immobile until the end of the presentation. When the room emptied, he hurled the device against the wall. Sophia, waiting in the adjoining office, heard the impact and entered. Richard paced from one side to another, competent. It wasn't the sadness of a father speaking. It was the fury of a commander who discovered a breach in his fortress. Sophia chose her words carefully. She said maybe it was time to offer a bigger settlement, something irrefutable, including his public exit from the marriage, with a narrative of mutual respect. Richard glared at her, as if she had suggested surrender. He said no one would bring him to his knees using his son's name. Sophia perceived the contradiction, but didn't point it out. Michael's name, ignored in life, was now used as a shield. Richard continued, stating, Helen needed to be isolated before contaminating board members, the press, and authorities. Sophia nodded, but her fear increased. That night, Helen received a package with no return address. Inside were photographs of her entering the coffee shop with Andrew, leaving his office, talking to Camille in the building garage. There was also a paper with a printed sentence, "Still time to stop." Helen spread the images on the kitchen table. The apartment seemed to watch her. For a moment, she felt the real loneliness of facing someone who could buy eyes on every corner. Then she grabbed the phone and sent everything to Andrew. Following that, she put water on to boil and prepared tea. The very serenity of that gesture surprised her. Before Michael, maybe she would have trembled for hours. But it didn't command alone anymore. Loss of control, an angry message that could be used against her. Instead, she logged the package, photographed the envelope, saved possible fingerprints, and wrote in the evidence diary, "Intimidation received at 9:40 p.m. signature, characteristic of coercive attempt." The dry language was armor. Andrew reacted with concern, but also a point of strategic satisfaction. The intimidation showed Richard was uncomfortable. They filed a new motion, attaching the package as evidence of attempted obstruction and harassment. Meanwhile, Camille convinced the system's tech to provide an encrypted copy of access logs without violating third-party clinical data. Lucy organized her notes into a timeline. For the first time, the case ceased to depend solely on Helen's word. It became a network of facts starting to converse with each other. The decisive datum emerged from an unexpected source. Oscar, the building doorman, sought Helen out on Saturday morning. He was nervous, holding his cap with both hands. He said the condo maintained logs of entry and exit, including garage footage and internal call times. On the night of the crisis, Helen had requested the car. At 1:28 a.m., Oscar remembered, because he never forgot Michael's face in her arms. But there was something else. Richard had ordered the Grodin, all administration the following afternoon, to delete any file from that period for family privacy. Helen felt her blood run cold. She asked if the files had been deleted. Oscar explained the manager obeyed partially, but he, suspicious, saved a copy of the lobby camera and the call log to the driver. He didn't know if it served for anything. Helen wanted to hug him, but perceived the man's humble embarrassment and just thanked him with firmness. It served. Yes, it served to prove the urgency, the time, Michael's state, and the subsequent attempt to cover tracks. Oscar seemed to age with relief. With these elements, Andrew prepared a more robust complaint to the Attorney General's office and requested a preliminary hearing. He also began contacting investigative journalists, not to leak everything, but to guarantee that if something happened to proof or a witness, there would be external eyes paying attention. Helen resisted at first. She feared transforming Michael into a headline. Andrew reminded her that Richard had already done that, just as a propaganda piece. The difference was, Helen wouldn't sell an image. She would defend a truth. Still, she imposed limits. No photos of the body. No sensationalist exposure. No phrases stolen from recordings without purpose. Meanwhile, Sophia discovered something that could save her or condemn her. Reviewing documents at Richard's request, she found transfers made by a Tain consulting firm linked to her to a company used in digital smear campaigns. Richard had used her structure without explaining the scope. If the investigation advanced, her name would appear as an indirect financier of the Section's second financier of the attacks against Helen. For the first time, Sophia felt she wasn't a partner, but a fuse. She saying everyone was under pressure, and she shouldn't worry about technical details. Sophia replied that technical details sent people to prison. Richard looked at her with disdain, as if her intelligence had ceased to be charmed to become a threat. He said she gained a lot by being at his side and now needed to demonstrate gratitude. The word gratitude wounded Sophia's pride. That night, she understood the love she imagined conquering was just a smaller room within the same empire. Helen received the most painful confirmation 3 weeks after Michael's death. Andrew obtained, by court order, the partial log of app activities on Richard's cell phone. The document showed that at 1:54 a.m., he opened the authorization request sent by the system. The request remained visible for 42 seconds. Then it timed out without confirmation. Shortly before, he viewed one of Helen's messages Richard had known. Not everything, perhaps not the exact line between life and death, but he knew enough to choose. Helen read the report in Andrew's office. The words on the page seemed too simple to carry such horror. Request opened. No action taken. Message viewed. No. Response sent. She stood immobile, and Andrew didn't try to speak. Camille, present as a technical witness, began crying silently. Helen thought of Michael, asking if his dad was coming. Thought of herself saying he was. The truth finally showed its whole face. Richard hadn't just been absent. He had been in front of the door and chose not to turn the key. When she returned home, Helen didn't turn on the lights, walked to her son's room, and sat on the floor between the stone planets and the drawings of blue moons. She opened the tablet and looked for the recording she hadn't yet had the courage to hear, marked as, "For Daddy." Her finger hovered over the screen for a pleasant, long time, then pressed. Michael's voice emerged small, hesitant. He said maybe his dad was always busy because he needed to take care of a lot of people. He said when he got better, he wanted to visit the company and see the big office. The recording continued. Michael said he wasn't mad when his dad missed things. He just felt like he had saved a joke for a long time, and no one came to listen. Then he laughed, embarrassed by his own comparison. Helen brought her hand to her chest. There was no accusation, just the terrible purity of a child trying to protect the man who wounded him via absence. At the end, Michael said I loved his dad even when he was late. The final sentence seemed to cross the Werble apartment walls, reach the city, and beat against Richard's glass tower. The next morning, Helen handed Andrew authorization to use the app log in a proceedings, public hearing if necessary. She also allowed the recording for the father to be preserved as emotional proof, though requiring it only be presented if Richard tried to dehumanize Michael or reduce him to a medical complication. Andrew promised to respect that. It wasn't just a legal decision. It was a choice about how to maintain a child's dignity before adults capable of transforming everything into a weapon. Helen left the office, knowing the next step would have no return. Richard learned of the report that same day. Mr. Vance explained the information was grave, but still manageable if they managed to discredit the interpretation. They could say Richard opened the app without comprehending the urgency, that he was emotionally exhausted. The system was confusing. Richard listened, but the one word viewed repeated in his mind, like a mechanical accusation. For the first time, he remembered not cameras or boards, but Michael's face trying to tie his shoes alone. The memory came late and lasted little, soon buried by the instinct for survival. He ordered total offense, litigious divorce, questioning Helen's emotional capacity, private investigation on Andrew, pressure on the hospital, preparation of press notes, and containment of Sophia. Saying her name, he realized he trusted no one anymore. Michael's death had opened a crack through which secrets, alliances, and masks escaped. Richard looked out his office window from the top of the building bearing his name and felt an almost infantile anger. All that was his, the company, the narrative, the family, the obedient city. How did Helen dare not obey? Helen, in turn, spent the afternoon organizing the next timeline. There was no triumph on her face, nor relief. Every confirmed proof hurt like a second death. Still, there was a silent change in her way of breathing. The woman Richard, imagined broken, was learning to cross her own grief without handing him command of the story. On the desk beside the documents, she placed one of Michael's stones, the one he called Planet Courage. It was small, gray, common. In his hands, it had been a universe. At night, Andrew phoned to warn that the preliminary hearing was scheduled and there was a possibility corporate representatives would be summoned. The press might discover sooner than predicted. Helen thanked him and hung up. Then she opened the window. The Manhattan skyline was lit, indifferent, and immense. Somewhere, Richard planned to destroy her socially. Elsewhere, Sophia decided if she would save herself. In many unknown apartments, families might still be, awaiting authorizations that shouldn't exist. Helen thought of Michael and spoke, in a low voice, not as empty promise, but as oath. No one else will call this a fatality. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a gray morning, one of those where the city seemed to hesitate before waking up. Helen arrived at the courthouse, without escort, wearing a simple dark dress and carrying a thin folder against her chest. Andrew walked beside her, discreet, attentive to the journalists gathered at the entrance. The cameras turned to Helen as soon as she got out of pause. The car and a rain of questions tried to surround her before the door. She didn't answer, not out of fear, but because she learned that certain truths lose power when launched into the wrong noise. Richard arrived 15 minutes later in a black SUV, accompanied by Vance, 2 aides, and the grave expression of someone who rehearsed humanity before the pride mirror. His hair was impeccable. The dark suit fell without a crease out of place, and his face carried a pallor that many confused with suffering. Seeing Helen on the other side of the hallway, he inclined his head in an almost intimate greeting made for the cameras. She didn't correspond. His gesture hung, suspended in the air, too false to be comfort, too weak to be threat. Inside the hearing room, the main table separated the deponents from representatives of the Attorney General's office and the State Medical Ethics Commission. There was less grandiosity than Richard imagined. No mahogany, no chandeliers. Just hard chairs, microphones, and stacks of documents. Still, he knew the power of that space didn't come from decoration. It came from the record. Everything there would be recorded, transcribed, compared. Every word could be used against someone. Richard, accustomed to closed-door meetings where versions substituted facts, felt for the first time the discomfort of not controlling the walls. Helen sat between Andrew and Camille, who had been subpoenaed as a witness. The nurse squeezed her hands in her lap, but kept her eyes raised. Behind them, Lucy remained in the second row, shoulders tense, a folder of notes on her knees. Oscar was also there, displaced in his cheap suit, looking at the floor as if fearing to dirty the place with his own simplicity. Helen turned briefly to him and nodded. That small recognition seemed to steady the doorman in his chair. No, one there was, alone. The session began with the formal reading of objectives. Ascertain possible irregularities in the emergency care of Michael Davis Sterling. Evaluate authorization protocols of Sterling Health Global. And verify indications of obstruction or manipulation of information post-mortem. Richard heard his Soane's full name without altering his expression. The technique he used on boards of directors worked by habit. First, let the accusation seem too cold, then occupy the emotional space with human phrases. When given the opening word, he leaned into the microphone with controlled sadness. He said Michael's death was a wound, impossible to describe, that no company, no career, no family conflict should obscure the central fact that a beloved child had departed. He affirmed, respecting Helen's pain, even when she, taken by despair, sought answers in places where perhaps there was only destiny. He spoke of his dedication to healthcare, the thousands of patients served by the network, investments in technology and prevention. His voice was low, well modulated, almost paternal. Some present wrote notes. Helen just observed. When her turn came, Helen didn't tell Michael's story first. She opened the Clothing the Steady Dot folder and placed a timeline before the commission. 1:23 a.m. First call to Richard. 1:28 a.m. Car requested concierge. 1:30, 1 a.m. Authorization request sent to plan holder. 1:54 a.m. Request opened on Richard's device. No. Confirmation. 2:17 a.m. Time of death. Her voice didn't tremble. The room, which expected tears, received minutes, data, and a whole mother. Richard shifted in his chair. Vance touched his arm, requesting calm without words. Helen continued, explaining Michael's cardiac condition with medical precision, but without transforming her son into a chart. She said he was a known risk, patient, monitored, with registered history and specific executive plan for emergencies. She explained the system required holder confirmation at a moment, incompatible with clinical urgency. She said the problem wasn't just marital, although Richard's absence had been decisive. The problem was structural. A child needed to breathe while an app awaited permission. The lead prosecutor, Miss Lydia Ramos, asked if Helen believed authorization would have changed the outcome. Helen breathed slowly before answering. She said, "No honest doctor would promise absolute result in a grave case, but every honest doctor would recognize that delays in pediatric cardiac crisis diminished intervention possibilities." She didn't say Michael would have lived. She said he had chances removed by silence, bureaucracy, and administrative fear. The difference mattered. She didn't sell impossible certainty. She demanded accountability for what could be proven. Camille deposed next. Initially, her voice came out low, but it grew as she described Helen's arrival with Michael in her arms. The urgency of signs, the team's attempts, and the authorization barrier. Vance tried to suggest the nurse, out of old affection for Helen, might interpret facts partially. Camille stared at him and replied that a cardiac monitor didn't have affection system, timestamps didn't have affection, and a child in arrhythmia didn't wait for lawyers to decide the adequate word for his death. A murmur ran through the room. Richard looked at Camille with a coldness that in another environment might make her retreat. Here, before microphones, his threat lost part of its reach. Lucy was called next. She presented her notes, explained the internal logic of risk codes, described how high-cost patients were subjected to additional reviews under neutral administrative language. She didn't use exaggerated terms, didn't call anyone a murderer. Precisely for that, her testimony became more devastating. The cruelty of the system appeared without need of adjectives. Vance rose to contest the validity of the notes. He said they were personal, records without corporate authentication, fruit of resentment from a former Fagin, employee let go after poor performance. Lucy paled but didn't break. She said she left because she wouldn't accept signing opinions that transformed urgency into accounting disputes. Added that if the company surrendered auditing histories spontaneously, it would be easy to verify if her notes coincided with official records. The room went still. Richard averted his eyes for the first time. Vance asked the question, "Be considered impertinent." Miss Ramos didn't seem impressed by the request. She determined the solicitation for expanded records be evaluated at the end of the session. Andrew maintained a neutral face, but Helen perceived a discreet shine in his eyes. It was an important breach. Richard also perceived it. His hand closed over his pen until his knuckles turned white. The man who crossed decades, molding others' perception, saw common people: a nurse, former auditor, doorman, underestimated wife pulling threads from his carefully hung tapestry. Oscar deposed with shame, answering in short sentences. Said he saw Michael in his mother's arms. The boy seemed very bad. Helen left in a hurry, and the next day he received guidance from the manager to delete records of the night for family privacy. When asked why he kept the copy, he swallowed dryly and said, privacy was one thing, but erasing a child's desperation was another. The simple sentence crossed the room with a force no speech of Richard's could imitate. Helen lowered her eyes to hide emotion. When Richard was questioned about the request opened on his phone, his strategy changed. He said he was in a private meeting, tired, with various simultaneous notifications, and didn't comprehend the gravity. Affirmed Helen used to call repeatedly in moments of family tension, and his judgment that night, though painfully mistaken, wasn't malicious. He used the word guilt carefully. Said he would carry guilt forever. Helen observed his effort to transform choice into confusion, negligence into subjective tragedy, responsibility into private feeling. Miss Ramos asked why he didn't return any of the calls after viewing the message. Richard drank water. The silence lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. He said he didn't remember exactly the content viewed, that he might have opened the notification without fully reading, that he was in a state of emotional overload due to professional problems. Andrew requested authorization to present the screenshot of the message sent before the app opening. The prosecutor authorized. On the screen appeared Helen's phrase, "Richard, it's grave. This isn't an argument. It's our son." The room changed temperature. Richard remained immobile, but his eyes darkened. That message destroyed the fog he tried to create. There was no jealousy there, provocation, or domestic drama. There was a direct, clear plea without ornament. Vance tried arguing partial reading equaled full comprehension. Andrew replied that full comprehension of an emergency wasn't a requisite for a father to return a call about his cardiac son. He didn't raise his voice. The phrase was sufficient. Some journalists authorized to follow part of the session wrote, furiously, Richard then committed his first visible error. He said Helen was using Michael to destroy his life. The phrase escaped before Vance could stop it. For an instant, the CEO substituted the grieving father. The man offended in his authority appeared raw, impatient, indignant. Not with death, but with the woman's disobedience before him. Helen raised her eyes. She didn't smile, didn't respond. Immediately, let the poison of the phrase spread alone. Miss Ramos asked Richard to rephrase, but the damage was already recorded. Helen requested permission to speak. Andrew hesitated because he knew the emotional risk of the next step. She touched lightly the folder keeping Michael's tablet and nodded. She told the commission that until that moment she avoided using personal recordings of her son, as she didn't want to transform his intimacy into spectacle. But faced with the attempt to reduce him to an instrument of vengeance, she needed to remind them who Michael was, not an ETHN's argument, not a complication, not a piece in image dispute. A child who loved, his father who didn't return. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The recording began with a low hiss. Then came Michael's voice, small and hesitant, saying maybe his dad was always busy because he took care of a lot of people. Richard closed his eyes immediately. not out of reverence, but defense. Michael said he wanted to visit the company, see the big office, save a joke too, and tell when his dad had time. Some present cried silently. Sophia, watching the blank-wanting Maite, restricted transmission in a private company room, brought her hand to her mouth. Even she, trained in self-preservation, felt the violence of that innocence. The boy's voice ended, saying he loved his dad even when he was late. No sound came for a few seconds. It wasn't empty silence. It was the type of silence that forms when an entire room understands a moral truth just surpassed juridical language. Helen collected the tablet without theatricality. She said, just that Michael wasn't there to condemn anyone. He was there because they tried to speak for him. And no one, not even his father, had the right to preventum his father, transform a child's loneliness into administrative detail. Richard opened his eyes. There were tears in them, but Helen couldn't tell if they came from pain, shame, or defeat. Maybe a bit of everything, too late and too small. He tried, saying Michael's name, but his voice failed. Vance asked for a recess. The prosecutor granted 15 minutes. As soon as microphones were off, Richard rose abruptly and went to the side hallway. Helen remained seated. She didn't follow him. Her part in that scene ended. The rest belonged to the man who finally heard his son without being able to interrupt. In the hallway, Richard leaned his hand on the wall and breathed as if the Padikam building had run out of air. For an instant, he saw Michael not as procedural threat, but as boy. Saw the small body trying to climb into his lap during an AT event, drawings left on his desk, the look waiting at the bedroom door. The memory almost knocked him down. Then his phone vibrated with messages from board members, aides, political allies. The reality he chose returned as heat. His remorse, unable to compete with reputational panic, retreated to a dark region. Sophia called while he was still in the hallway, said the recording changed everything. Press would find some way to access excerpts. Foreign investors, already asking for clarifications. Richard asked if that was what she had to say. After hearing Michael, there was a pause. Sophia replied that feelings didn't prevent warrants, class actions, or freezes. Her coldness hit him because it seemed like a mirror. He ended the call without goodbye. Sophia sat looking at the device, comprehending her utility was also beginning to dissolve. When the session resumed, the commission authorized new document requisitions, including audit logs, emergency authorization protocols, and internal places coordinated. Sterling Health Communications related to Michael's death also recommended the Attorney General open formal investigation for possible obstruction, systemic negligence, and information manipulation. It wasn't a final sentence, but enough to break the public narrative built by Richard. Vance protested, used technical terms, invoked commercial secrets. Miss Ramos replied that commercial secrets couldn't serve as a blanket to hide risk to life. Leaving the room, Helen was surrounded by journalists. This time she stopped, before microphones. Andrew stood by her side but didn't speak for her. Helen said she sought neither spectacle nor vengeance. She sought the truth about Michael's death and about a system transforming care into conditioned privilege. Said no family should beg for authorization while a child fought to breathe. Her voice remained firm to the end. When a reporter asked if she blamed Richard, Helen replied responsibilities would be investigated, but choices had already been made. The phrase opened evening newscasts. Choices had already been made. In a few hours, the image of Richard crying in the chapel was substituted by chronologies, medical debates, and reports from other families saying they faced similar delays. Sterling Health released a statement affirming commitment to transparency. But the word now seemed a freshly painted door before a burning building. Anonymous employees sent documents to journalists. Ex-patients recorded testimonials. The wall didn't fall all at once. It began undoing itself. From inside, brick by brick, Richard gathered the board emergently that night. Some directors were still loyal, but corporate loyalty lasts only while the fall seems improbable. The board chairman, a man who for years toasted beside him, spoke of temporary leave to preserve the company. Richard reacted as if betrayed by ungrateful sons, reminded them of conquests, acquisitions, profits, records. No one contested, but all saw the same abyss. Profit didn't answer a dead child's voice. Charts didn't erase Helen's phrase projected in newspapers. Sophia tried entering the meeting but was barred by an aide. The humiliation was small and public enough to define a turning point. She returned to her own office, opened the safe, and removed copies of contracts, transfer receipts, and messages where Richard authorized defamation campaigns against Helen using intermediary consultancies. Until then, she kept that as private insurance. That night, she understood insurance only served if triggered before the fire reached the door. She wrote an anonymous message to Andrew offering documents in exchange for legal protection. Andrew received the message while accompanying Helen to her apartment. Showed her only essentials, without mentioning Sophia's name until confirmed. Helen showed no surprise. She had learned rotted empires always produce traitors. Not out of conscience, but fear of sinking together. Asked if documents would help other families. Andrew said yes, obstruction campaign, and link Richard directly to attempt to demoralize. Helen nodded. There was no pleasure in it. Every new proof revealed one more layer of degradation around Michael's memory. In the apartment, for first time since death, Helen entered kitchen and prepared simple meal. Didn't eat much, but sat at table. Stone Michael called Planet. Courage continued beside documents. She held it in palm and felt cold surface. Thought how many people spoke that day despite fear. Camille, Lucy, Oscar, other families starting to emerge. Richard spent life convinced everyone had price. Discovered now some people, when losing enough, ceased to be buyable. In early morning, Richard returned to apartment without warning. Helen heard key, indoor, and remained in living room. He entered haggard, suit jacket open, tie loose, appearing older than in mourning. For a second house returned them to ancient times, before empire became more intimate than marriage, before Michael learned to wait. Richard looked around, as if only now noticing absence of scattered toys, empty hallway, silence without child breathing. Said needed to talk to her. Helen didn't rise. Richard remained standing, knowing not where to put hands. Said heard recording, and it destroyed him. Choice of verb revealed all. Didn't say recording reminded him of son, nor broke his soul. Said destroyed him. Helen felt tired, sadness, almost without anger. Asked if came to ask forgiveness or negotiate damages. Richard closed eyes. When opened, hard. Again. Said she didn't understand size of what unleashing, Helen replied. understood better than he thought. Understood frightened employees, silenced families, bought lawyers, manipulated journalists, women called crazy when threatening powerful men. Understood also child waiting for father who saw message and didn't return. Richard took step toward her but stopped. Invisible presence of Michael seemed to occupy space between two. For first time didn't find phrase capable reorganizing reality in favor. Language, preferred tool, abandon him. Said almost whisper, didn't know Michael would die. Helen, sustained look, replied that was part he would repeat to manage sleep. Maybe, even true in strict sense. He didn't know minute, didn't know line on monitor, didn't know last sigh, but knew son needed him and chose not respond. Difference between not knowing death and ignoring request for life was where he would have to dwell from then on. Richard brought hand to face, and for instant seemed to break. Helen didn't move to console. In other era would have done by instinct, carrying even guilt of one wounding her. Now comprehended certain pains belong to owners. Richard cried little, in silence, more frightened than repentant, then withdrew as if ashamed of own weakness, and said lawyers would continue, handling everything. Helen rose then, said yes, lawyers handle lawsuits, justice, handle facts, and she handle Michael, as always handled, guaranteeing death not used to protect one abandoning. Richard left without answer. Door closed gently, and gentleness seemed more final than any slam. Helen remained alone in apartment, but didn't feel same loneliness of first night. There was network now, fragile and real, formed by people refusing obey lie. Walked to Michael's room, opened window let cold air in. In overcast sky, no star visible. Still, remembered son's recording. Some lights continue arriving after source goes out. Next morning, Richard's temporary removal announced by Sterling Health Board. Word temporary tried preserve bridge, but everyone knew burned at both ends. Formal investigation would start. Documents seized. Consultancy accounts traced. Sophia, before lateral image luxury ambition, transformed potential informant. Vance prepared defenses. Board members prepared distances. Allies prepared forgetting. Helen read news without celebrating. Richard's fall didn't resurrect Michael, but first time prevented silence, continuing reign in name. Richard's removal didn't produce silence. Contrary, open door, behind which decades of murmurs seemed to wait permission exist. In following days, Sterling Health Headquarters received regulators, independent auditors, prosecutors with warrants broad enough make experienced directors lose color. Boxes, documents, removed archives, before answering only internal passwords, personal loyalties, computers sealed, calendars copied, servers mirrored. Helen accompanied everything distance without pleasure, knowing every folder opened, confirmed not only Richard's guilt, but extension of what Michael never should have needed reveal with own life. Richard watched first searches from glassed, office already without right occupy main chair. Wore same type impeccable suit, but clothes now seemed dress smaller man. Board members before awaiting opinion, breathe past him short greetings, eyes diverted, cell phones glued ear. Company, carrying surname learned, quickly speak him third person, as if Richard Sterling, administrative phase uncomfortable not architect empire. He felt betrayal as injustice, incapable, accepting many just imitated logic taught, Sophia delivered documents via preliminary agreement prosecutor's office. No, noble gesture decision herself didn't try feign greatness. Sitting before Andrew, Miss Ramos maintained elegant posture but hands betrayed badly slept nights. Showed consulting contracts, payment receipts, encrypted messages linking Richard, campaign present, Helen unstable. Also revealed meetings, death, Michael treated, crisis communication, before treated tragedy, every phrase attempt save herself, but still served truth. Helen heard summary Sophia deposition, Andrew office, didn't ask intimate details, nor wanted know how Mistress looked pronouncing. Michael name. Limits needed preserve not allow dirt others occupy space's memory. Andrew explained documents. Strengthened complaint, obstruction, intimidation, economic abuse. Also helped demonstrate Richard acted consciously manipulate narrative post-death. Helen nodded looking folder table. Asked just if help, prevent new emergency delays. Andrew replied, yes, maybe more than any. Compensation. Investigation began pressure regulators, hospitals, insurers, review, automatic authorization protocols, critical cases. Michael name appeared. Technical discussions, legislative proposals, editorials. Helen received news. Strange pain, mixed pride, refusal. No mother desires son becomes symbol, because like AP, died. Still, if absence could open corridors other children breathe didn't have. Right turn face. Justice comprehended rarely arrived pure. Arrived mixed ashes. Formal fall Richard. Happened extraordinary board meeting. Transmitted only. Shareholders registered minutes. Tried. Resist. End arguing company. Needed. Continuity accusations. Still. Not convictions. Internal adversaries used family. Tragedy seized control. Spoke nearly 40 minutes, recovering moments ancient. Authority. But board already made accounts. Investors pressured public contracts. Under review. Stocks plummeted. Same world rewarded coldness now demanded. Sacrificed. Protect brand. Voting fast. Richard lost executive presidency removed. Operational decision end investigations. When heard result didn't shout just, remained seated looking table. Where often humiliated subordinates, calculated, silences. Now him receiving silence others. Old director, maybe pity said, necessary preserve institution. Richard laughed once. Without humor, replied. Institution was him. No one agreed. No one needed disagree. Door opened empire, continued existing while conducted outside. News arrived Helen late afternoon, organizing Michael clothes donation. Folding every t-shirt seemed harder facing. Lawyers. Small paint stains unstitched hem blue hoodie used cold fearful days. When Andrew called, sat bed heard silence. Richard lost position. Investigation. Advance personal corporate responsibilities. Possibility. Real asset freeze. Helen thanked. Then hung up. Remained child t-shirt lap. Waiting relief didn't come. Didn't come because victory didn't have sound justice imagined. Nights. Anger. No music reparation, full return, impossible. Just step less path man, finally finding limits. Helen cried not, Richard Michael. Cried didn't see. Anything run. Room ask father learned. Arrive early. Fall CEO didn't fill empty. Chair table. However when tears passed, remained clean certainty. Lie already. Didn't govern alone. In following months, civil lawsuit, criminal investigations, moved slowness proper, institutions, but didn't stop. Families sought Andrew. Camille deposed again. Lucy delivered details. Oscar protected witness. Press, after initial enthusiasm, tried. Transform. Everything. Spectacle, Helen maintained distance. Spoke only when. Could contribute concrete changes. Refused invitations programs. Wanted tears. Prime time. Michael not consumed public curiosity. Story serve responsibility. Not offered. Richard turn. Shrank inside life. No longer recognized. Penthouse. Apartment refuge seemed too big man without official agenda. Received few. Visitors almost all lawyers. Sophia disappeared routine efficiency, knowing. Abandoned ships before sink completely. Some nights Richard heard recording. Michael leaked short clips people watched hearing, although Helen never authorized wide circulation. Each time Sun voice said loved, even when late. Richard felt something similar, pain still mixed resentment. Wondered why no one remembered. Years worked, build hospitals, acquire clinics, generate jobs. Question, revealed still didn't understand. Confused scale, goodness, profit, merit, public, presence, love. Moments almost reached truth. Usually late-night silence removed. Defenses. Saw phone vibrating hotel table. Saw own hand turning screen down. Saw authorization opened. Left expire. Then Rose drank water. Called Vance, asked. Procedural updates. As if legal details anesthetize memory. Divorce concluded. Ceremony. Richard tried negotiate confidentiality clauses. Position weakened too much. Helen accepted only legally due, destined considerable part values, blocked, subsequently released project began design still process. Didn't want ornamental, foundation, carrying names, dead golden plaques, repeating vanity living. Wanted, real center pediatric emergency care legal guidance, families support health, professionals, pressured abusive protocols. Name, chosen Michael Davis Institute. Helen refused surname Sterling, plaque not vengeance precision. Michael loved, cared remembered territory name. Davis represented her. Richard family protested, discreetly alleging erasure. No one courage carry complaint forward. Inauguration, happened 1 year. Child death, clear mourning grounds, old reformed community, clinic. White walls, internal garden playroom, small emergency room equipped act. Before bureaucracies learned block doors. Camille became nursing coordinator. Institute. Lucy assumed ethical auditing area responsible review flows prevent. Financial decision hide behind incomprehensible technical language. Andrew remained legal consultant, creating free guidance program, families, conflicts, health plans. Oscar invited Helen, attended inauguration, using same simple suit, hearing. Constrained, mentioned someone helped preserve truth, cried, saw near, garden small gray stone placed under Michael plaque. Helen discoursed little, said institute didn't birth. Victory wound refused, turned silence, said Michael. Liked stars, rockets, jokes, saved too long. Said no technology contract social, position worth more urgency life. Voice failed. Only once affirmed love, couldn't, prevent all losses, could prevent some losses. Repeated neglect. People applauded. Slow, not corporate events, recognized grief, transformed service. Richard watched, part inauguration television. Local channel transmitted clips showed Helen, garden surrounded children, doctors, families. A lone seated armchair before seemed, throne now seemed hiding place, Hearing name, Michael Davis Institute felt pang. Exclusion almost confused nostalgia. Took phone, wrote message, Helen. Erased. Wrote another. Erased again. Finally typed, just like see her speak, Michael. Stared screen, long minutes, send. Helen received message after inauguration. Building already emptier, sun-crossed playroom windows. Didn't answer immediately. Walked, garden. Sat near plaque. Michael name shown discreetly excess. Thought. Boy. Tendency. Forgive delays. Stubborn hope, father one day time. Answering Richard not. Duty Michael. Obligation her. Still something pending. Reconcilable. Irreconcilable. Close last room, old house. Met week later. Quiet square, far cameras. Richard arrived before appearance. Aged. Movements less secure. No longer advisors. Driver waiting. View, aura, invincibility. Day occupied space, enter. Helen came alone. Wore light clothes, hair-tied face. Serene cross storm without feigning body carried marks. Richard Rose saw. Habit tried conduct situation. Presence disarmed. Said, just thanks coming. Sat. Bench tall trees. Sometime neither spoke. Children played distant sound. Laughter made Richard close eyes. Said thought Michael every day. Helen didn't. Answer didn't know. Confession request defense. Richard continued. Said lost. Everything. Position, reputation, friends, control. List revealed order losses. Mind. Helen looked sadness. Tenderness. Said Michael. Not end list, never should. Competed. Richard lowered head. First time didn't respond argument. Said didn't. I know ask forgiveness. Helen believed. People passed life training command. Forgot. Grammar, humility. Tried. Explain. Night. Thought Helen exaggerated, tired, felt. Trapped life demands hospitals. Words old voice no longer arrogance sufficient. Make weapons. Helen let finish. Afterwards. Said explanations. Could clarify. Mechanism failure. Didn't erase choice. Asked if hated. Helen delayed answer. Looked children. Square girl falling. Rising laughing. Mother cleaning son knee. Careful distraction. Said hatred demanded constant presence him inside her. Give place anymore. Richard seemed suffer phrase more insults. Asked. If form. Forgiveness. Helen replied. Perhaps existed forgiveness didn't reopen doors. Just closed corridors. Still didn't know arrived there. Richard cried then. Without. Elegance utility, said Michael loved. Didn't deserve. Helen felt heart squeeze. Pity man. Simple truth phrase. Michael loved. Yes. Love. Child. Medal. Merit. Trust. Delivered judgment. Richard received. Left waiting. Helen said, only form honor. Rest. Love. Stop fighting. Truth. Assume. Responsibilities. Deliver documents. Repair. Families accept convictions came. Strategy minimum. Didn't promise immediately. Honesty maybe first time. Prevented false promise. Said, try. Helen rose. Richard, 2. Second seemed desire. Hug comprehended. Didn't write. Said goodbye. Nod. Moving away heard. Say Michael. Name low. Almost prayer learned afternoon. Helen. Didn't turn face. Some goodbyes need happen. Witnesses internal look again. Confuse closure return. Left square feeling pain prison. Years followed Michael. Davis Institute became Reference Pediatric Emergency Care Patient Defense. Protocols created adopted smaller hospitals. State law prohibited manual. Authorization requirements. Critical emergencies. Record risk. Helen participated. Technical construction proposal. Refusing call law Michael official events. Said, son name where needed garden rooms lives continued. Someone attended time. Richard faced long processes. Condemned civil actions lost significant part. Assets responded criminally obstruction. Indirect falsification corporate. Records. Sentence satisfied. Almost cases involve power death. Still, man, before. Moved above consequences. Started live inside. Final hearings, delivered documents. Helped other families obtain reparation. No one knew certain repentance. Calculation fatigue. Helen didn't need no. Result mattered late purity. Sophia. Left country period returned years without social shine, sought hunger. Collaboration reduced legal damages didn't erase public mark participation. Rare. Interviews claimed, manipulated powerful man. Truth partial. But Helen hearing, phrase once turned television off. Sophia used yes, chose use. Justice didn't. Demand Helen follow destiny. Enough. None could walk intact memory boy. Afternoon. Spring 3 years inauguration. Helen found boy seated Garden Institute holding gray stones similar. Michael. Past emergency intervention morning, waited mother. Signed discharge papers. Asked Helen Stone's planets. Question crossed time. Delicacy. Unexpected needed breathe answer. Said yes. Someone new look. Boy. Smiled. Put stone pocket satisfied approval. Helen stayed left, observing garden. Small plaques indicated names, trees planted, families attended, wind moved new. Leaves building seemed a live way mansion ever. Still missed Michael every day. Longing didn't diminish easy phrases learned forms walk. Sometimes came closed. Fist light, morning cup, desire. Tell stars, finally reaching nights. Main room, institute drawing framed made. Michael months die. Showed house many windows huge. Door open, sky full blue moons. Helen passed every day. Beginning image broke. Started sustain. Understood open door. Richard didn't know. The system tried deny. Chosen build. Entrance password power. Useless wait arrived fighting air. Afternoon before leave. Helen entered empty playroom. Found table drawing left. Child. Woman lab coat. Boy rocket wings. Phrase written crooked letters saying no, one stays alone. Helen touched paper care. Didn't cry despair. Cried recognizes. Answer. Michael died alone since most unjust father called silence. Story. Created place. Other children surrounded. Presence, haste, dignity. Left garden sky. Beginning darken. Star appeared thin clouds, small, shy. Helen thought sun. Recording explanation lights continue arriving. Source goes out. Long time idea. Appeared cruel. Now consolation full truth sufficient live. Michael return. No. Sentence. Plaque. Late request. Change. Light crossed. Lie burned. Pride empire. Found. Shelter lives breathing. Helen closed institute gate haste. Inside nurses. Organized next shift. Doctors reviewed equipment. Mother thanked low voice. Attended delay. Outside city followed press indifferent. Something changed. Many. I didn't know name change. Helen walked car carrying pocket. Small stone Michael. Planet courage. No longer carried proof. Pain carried promise kept. Love, finally, found form remain.